Hello there, Lightroomers and photographers. I'm Jason Bradley. Welcome to another episode of Lightroom Live, broadcasting from my studio and gallery here in the heart of downtown Pacific Grove on the Monterey Peninsula. And we're re-recording today's webinar. For those of you that joined our last Lightroom Live session, my apologies yet again for the technical difficulties that we experienced. So I do have to re-record this for everybody who attempted to view our last live webinar. Well, before I jump in, there's a little bit of business that I want to take care of here. I want to talk about next Lightroom Live, which is happening on May 7th. It's not too far away. But we do have a guest for the next webinar. Her name is Jennifer Renwick. I got to know her recently. We taught together at the Out of Chicago, Out of Big Sur event. She's great, and I'm really excited to have her here. She's agreed to come in May 7th. She runs the Nature Photographers Network along with her partner David Kingham, and she's going to show a bunch of her landscape photography and talk about her workflow and developmental techniques. So we're very excited to welcome Jennifer Renwick to our next webinar. Again, that's going to be Tuesday, May 7th. The thing that we're going to switch around to remind everybody, I did mention this in the last Lightroom Live, and we're going to have this in all of our upcoming email blasts, is that we are not going to be doing Lightroom Live at 6 p.m. anymore Pacific time on that first Tuesday evening. Instead, we are moving our time to 11 a.m. on Tuesday, May 7th. And then for the rest of the webinars, we'll be doing those at 11 a.m. Instead of 6 p.m. Pacific time. All right, so note that, everybody. And again, Jennifer Renwick will be joining us on May 7th, so please do not miss that. So that said, let's jump into today's webinar, or re-recording of it, the ins and outs of sharpening. And that's it. Let me share my screen here. And here we go, the ins and outs of sharpening. And I'm going to start by talking about the tools of the sharpening trade. What tools do we use as Lightroom users, and specifically Lightroom Classic? Well, of course, there's the detail panel. And in the detail panel, there's three sub-panels. There's three subsections to it. The detail panel contains, of course, the sharpening panel, Denoise AI, manual noise reduction, and then there are other tools like Topaz AI, which consists of a suite. It's actually called the AI suite, which consists of programs like Gigapixel, wait for it, Topaz Denoise AI, and Topaz Sharpen AI. Together, this makes up a suite that can help you make your images look, well, fantastic. And they released some new algorithms with Gigapixel and their AI suite recently that I find extremely impressive. Of course, with any tool, there's pluses and minuses to using them, so we'll talk about that too as we go. In addition to Topaz, another option for us is to use another program called DxO Pure Raw 3. DxO Pure Raw 3 focuses mainly on denoising images, more so than sharpening. But DxO Pure Raw 3 is a fantastic tool. On1 has a denoising AI tool as well. I admittedly have not used the On1 Denoise AI very much. I used a version of it a few years ago, and I thought it was okay. Was it a few years ago? No, it was about a year ago, excuse me. And it was okay. I tend to stick to my workflow and in the workflow for the print lab that we have here, working with Adobe's Denoise AI, the Topaz suite, and DxO Pure Raw. And I kind of dance around between the three of them, and I find that sometimes one works better than the other. That said, I would say I mainly work with Topaz and what comes with Lightroom, the Adobe Denoise AI, with the occasional use of DxO. But between Topaz and Adobe, that handles a majority of my needs. And there are times, I'll go into this in more detail as well, when I might use one versus the other. All right, tool tips of the sharpening trade. Topaz, I said there's pluses and minuses. What are they? Topaz generates a raster file or a processed file. Well, let me keep going here. Lightroom and DxO, they keep your file in the raw format. And it's always a good idea to stay in the raw converter as much as you can. So as I mentioned, there's pluses and minuses to using Topaz. One of the pluses is Topaz gives you a lot of options on not just denoising and how you denoise and to what degree, and using this versus this algorithm to create the look that you want. But if you're playing with sharpening AI, it does a great job in giving you options how to sharpen images that might be out of focus for one reason or another. Noise blur, or having blur or out of focus images for other reasons. It will target images with different algorithms to sharpen them. And it works really well, I have to say. And Lightroom or Adobe doesn't give you that kind of control. So that's one of the reasons why when I use Topaz, if I'm trying to correct a specific kind of softness or out of blur, or out of focus thing because there's motion blur or something else, Topaz might be the tool to use to take care of that. So speaking generally, of course, except for DxO, sharpen at the end of your developmental workflow. And I say with DxO as an exception because the way that tool works, it just makes more sense to, if you know you're going to use it at the beginning of your workflow. It will create a second raw file for you, and then you can develop that second DxO generated raw file. Of course, if you don't do it and you do it the other way accidentally, not a big deal. You can always copy and paste your adjustments from your image that you developed onto the image that you sharpened with DxO, and vice versa, okay? But generally speaking, sharpen at the end of your developmental workflow. But let's talk for a minute about what is sharpening. We need to have a fundamental understanding of what sharpening is to effectively use the tool. And of course, to do that, we have to have some conversation about what contrast is, okay? And now let me get into that as we go. I'm going to mention, before I talk about what contrast is and how it works and why we like to use it, sometimes we like to overuse contrast. There are many contrast tools in Lightroom. There's, of course, the contrast slider itself. The tone curve panel is another contrast tool. And then there's sliders like the clarity slider, the dehaze slider, the texture slider. These are actually contrast tools at the end of the day. So that said, I'm going to show you here how some of those sliders work. I'm going to move you over to Lightroom for a second because there's an image that I want to show you to illustrate how contrast works. So let's talk about contrast. Let me switch over to Lightroom. Here we go. Here's an image that I took in Joshua Tree National Park of some white tank boulders, and bring it into the develop module. Is there any contrast to this image already? Let's take a look here. Nope, there's no contrast on this image. This is a raw, untouched file. And I'm going to go straight into, well, let's use the global contrast slider to begin with. If I take my contrast slider and move it back and forth, what contrast really ultimately does for us is it creates the feeling of depth within an image. We've probably all heard the term before at one point or another. This image looks flat. Well, the reason why that term is used, because it's another way of saying that it lacks contrast. There's a lack of definition in the shadows and highlights in one area or both of those areas. The tones are concentrated well to the midtones. And when that happens, the image doesn't feel like there's a lot of depth to it. There's contrast that can be added to it. So contrast ultimately is what I'm trying to say, is it gives us the feeling of depth within an image. And that happens by way of expanding and contracting midtones. So if I were to take this image here and move my contrast slider all the way to the left, keep an eye on what's going on. Let me get rid of my film strip here. Keep an eye on what's going on with that round boulder, that egg-shaped kind of boulder there in the left-hand side of the image. If I take my contrast slider and move it all the way to the left, the shadows kind of dissipate to some degree, right? And it looks more flat, if you will. Now, if I were to take my contrast slider and slowly move it to the right, increasing that shadow, that feeling of shadow, and that I should say that difference between the light areas and the dark areas, where we contract our midtones, the image has a feeling of more depth to it. So expand, contract, or expand, contract, expand, contract, okay? That's what contrast does for us. Now, going back to my keynote presentation, I want to show you this in terms of some sliders, okay? Let me go over to my keynote presentation again. And here we're going to look at a, a grayscale. On the left is black, on the white is right, and there is not a thing done to this. Nothing done to this image whatsoever. And if I take my contrast and put it all the way up, this is what happens. And let's look a little before and after, okay? Here is contrast all the way down and contrast up. Contrast. See that what's happening there? An expansion and a contraction of midtones. That's what contrast does. Pretty simple. Now, let's look at this grid or the scale with nothing done to it again. And now let's apply to it clarity all the way up. And then next slide, nothing again, clarity all the way down, right? Let's look at them before and after. Here's clarity all the way up, clarity all the way down, clarity all the way up and down. We go back and forth. So with this, there's a contraction and expansion of midtones as well. Notice that. But the difference here with clarity is that with clarity, it's adding contrast where contrast already exists. And where does contrast already exist? Is where those lines are. Okay, so where those lines are, this algorithm targets those lines and just makes them a little bit more distinct by adding a little bit more contrast to those zones where contrast already exists, in addition to globally expanding and contracting contrast or tonality as well. But I'm not done. Let's take a look at what happens when we use the texture slider. Here's nothing done to our grid again. And then here is texture all the way up, texture, nothing again, excuse me. And now texture all the way down. Okay, so let's see the before and afters. This is texture all the way up, texture all the way down. Now, what's different about this slider is it tends to do what, well, when they first released the clarity slider, what I wanted that, a lot of photographers wanted that clarity slider to do. And that is to actually add contrast just to the areas where contrast already exists, or to those lines, but it's not doing a global expansion or contraction of contrast, okay? So here's, again, a clarity texture all the way up, texture all the way down. Notice that there's not an expansion or a contraction of midtones here. It's just a defining of those lines or those areas where contrast already exists, okay? So that's really what we want with contrast. That's what those sliders do. And contrast and sharpening go hand in hand, okay? And to explain what I mean by that, let me go back over to Lightroom again, go one more time, stop my share here, and I'll start to share Lightroom again. And here's a Lightroom, and I'm sharing Lightroom now. And now I'm going to show the image, not this image, but wait for it. This image here. This is an image I took near Paso Robles, an oak tree with the sun setting behind it. And in this particular case, I'm going to zoom into this image a lot. Let me open up my navigator, and I'm going to zoom into this image 1600%. And what that's can allow me to do is see what's happening on a pixel by pixel level here. Let me open up my navigator again. And get our view right onto some of these branches. And you can see all the individual pixels here. Okay, now if I go open to the detail panel, and I sharpen, I turn my sharpening up, notice that you're going to start to see a change in contrast on a pixel by pixel level. So let me increase contrast here. And between the pixels, the light and the dark pixels, it amplifies that difference between the two. Here is sharpening turned down. Here is sharpening turned up. So that's all sharpening is. It's a contrast tool. It's a pixel by pixel contrast tool. It's all it is. So we need to have someone the idea what contrast is, how it works, how those different contrast sliders work, and then how that relates to sharpening. All sharpening is another contrast tool. So that said, let me go back to my keynote again. Stop sharing here. Share my screen in another way. Perfect. So contrast and sharpening. Now there's, of course, two kinds of sharpening that I want to talk about. There's resolution versus acutance. And resolution is the technical approach to sharpening. And that has to do with the amount of pixels that we're dealing with, the resolution. Are we dealing with a small resolution image or a high resolution image? And naturally, higher resolution images with more pixels, which means more information in the file, more information to display, is going to have the capability of showing like a whisker on a cat or whisker on a lion or something, and show the edges of that clearly and distinctly if there's enough pixels to be able to show that. However, if we don't have enough, if we have a low resolution, low pixel count, then we might not be able to show the fine edge of a detail there. So it's just a technical way of approaching approaching sharpening. We got to have, we want to see the fine details and sharpen those well. At the end of the day, we should have a high resolution file to begin with. Now there's acutance, and acutance is subjective. That's our perception of really what sharpening is. And there's different ways to perceive it. One person might perceive this image as sharp, another person might perceive it as soft. Some people overuse sharpening, but acutance is our perception, of the way we perceive sharpening as well. And with that said, now I'm going to talk about the difference between input and output sharpening, also known as creative versus applicative. Input sharpening is what we do within Lightroom, and output sharpening is the kind of sharpening that we apply to our images as we export them, as we process them, as we output them for a particular kind of application. And I might be exporting an image out of Lightroom for for a print that's using a really big file for a really big print. And then I might be exporting something out of Lightroom, or I might be using something small for posting on Instagram or something like that. So the kind of algorithm that we apply to an image that's going really, really big for print is different than the kind of algorithm, sharpening algorithm we apply to an image that's really, really small for, say, posting on social media. Two different types of things. So input sharpening is what we do in Lightroom, bit of an acutance approach. We want to make sure that it looks good in our program, and then we apply an output algorithm to it based on the application, okay? Input sharpening is done during the development phase of the workflow, and output sharpening is done at the file processing phase of the workflow. Input sharpening is subjective, or an acutance kind of sharpening, and output sharpening is done with respect to the size that is processed. Just to reiterate, it's a very, very important distinction, understanding the difference between input and output sharpening. Let's do a bit of a walkthrough of the detail panel, okay? In the detail panel, we have the amount of sharpening at the very top. We have underneath that radius, underneath that detail, and then underneath that masking. Okay. There's, of course, luminance noise. If we go down to the bottom where manual noise reduction sliders are, we have the ability to work with luminance noise and color noise. And then there, of course, back to the middle, the noise reduction part of this panel is the new Denoise AI feature. And the Denoise AI feature in Adobe, if you haven't used that yet, try it. It is amazing. It works amazingly well, and it's a great way to get some get your images looking good and sharp. But yes, sharpening and noise reduction do go hand in hand. You can't talk about one without the other, because as we sharpen, it brings out noise, and we want to manage that as we go. So if an image is de-sharpened or denoised, excuse me, if an image is denoised well, that allows us the latitude to use a little bit more of a sharpening algorithm to really get those edges and the details of our image looking exactly the way we want them to make it look crisp, and see all that detail when we're making our prints. Tips for input sharpening. Zoom in. When you're sharpening image, you want to zoom into that image 100%, a one-to-one view. You saw a minute ago, I zoomed in 1600%. We do have the ability to zoom in quite a lot in Lightroom, so we could even see pixel by pixel level stuff. You don't need to do that, but you at least need to see something at a one-to-one view, at a 100% view, in order to see the sharpening algorithm being applied to the details of your image to determine whether or not it just simply looks good or not. And that is the key for input sharpening, by the way. You don't want to sharpen with application in mind, okay? You want to zoom into one-to-one, and you want to play with that slider, that sharpening amount slider, so to the point where, okay, that looks good and sharp. And try not to overdo it. Contrast, whether we're using global contrast sliders, texture sliders, clarity sliders, or sharpening sliders. Contrast is seductive because we want more depth and more out of our image or more out of our images with these tools. And it's easy to take it too far. So keep that in mind when you're playing with any of those sliders, but particularly with sharpening. Sharpen and then try back off a little bit and think to yourself as you're backing off, is this really enough? Is this really all I need? Because it's very easy. Take it from somebody that runs a print lab that receives files every day from other photographers. It's easy to over sharpen our images. So zoom in and take a look at those details. That's got big help to doing it. Monitor your monitor your luminance and color noise patterns as you're sharpening. Okay, very important thing to do. So when you're sharpening, take a look at the details, but also take a look at what's happening to your noise, both your luminance and your color noise patterns as you go. What's the difference between luminance and color? Simple. The color noise patterns kind of show up as red, green, or kind of blue blotches or pixels, when the luminance is really just the noise pattern itself. Okay. Then zoom in more to look for chromatic aberration, if you will. So this is something that I would suggest to do. Well, anyway, zoom in and toward the edges of your image, there's something that could happen on the edges of your detail, referred to as chromatic aberration, and that shows up as like a yellow, a purple, or a magenta, or even a green kind of halo that you won't see necessarily just on your computer screen, certainly not on a thing like Instagram. But when you start getting into making medium and large size prints, that stuff is going to show up. Okay, so chromatic aberration is something I want to be paying attention to as well. Sharpen locally is a tip that I would suggest here. And sure, what I mean by sharpen locally is you can use your localized correction tools. Go into your masking tools, and you can use a brush tool, or you can use a radial filter, or any one of those tools, and target specific areas of your image with more or less sharpening. There is a sharpness slider to play with your masking tools as well. More tips, and then tips for output sharpening, I would suggest. Just pick one. It's pretty simple. And what I mean by just pick one is Lightroom doesn't really give you a lot of options, and it doesn't need to give you a lot of options. Tip 2, refer to the previous answer, and that's it. You don't have to do much with output sharpening. What I mean by that is when we're in Lightroom and we've done our input sharpening and we've done it to taste, and we make sure it looks good and the detail looks the way we want it. At that point, when we're exporting our image, one of the steps that we do during export is we tell Lightroom, I'm going to export this image at this size, being it height or width, let's say 8 by 12 inch image at 300 DPI. So I'm telling Lightroom the size of the image, and then Lightroom gives me an option on how to apply output sharpening, but all it offers is high, low, or standard, and that's it. Or no, I take it back. There's Three more very complicated options: glossy paper, matte paper, or for screen. And that's it. So first you got to choose the medium. Are you going to glossy paper, matte paper, or is this for a computer screen? Easy. And the next is high standard or low. I 99.9% of the time just leave it on standard. And I don't play with high and I don't play with low. If I've done my input sharpening well and I pay close attention to that, Lightroom does a fantastic job when it exports as mimicking the look of that with my output size that I've designated for it, be it 8x12 at 300 DPI, 40x60 at 300 DPI, or something small for Instagram, or I'm defining it not by way of DPI and height and width, by way of pixels, 1800 pixels wide, 1000 pixels wide, whatever it may be. Lightroom will see the size that I'm exporting this at and will apply an output sharpening rhythm accordingly. And it does it really well. So there's not much to think about for output sharpening with Lightroom. With Photoshop, that's a totally different story. If you're a Photoshop user, well, then it's the suggested workflow is you size your image first to your application size, be it a big print, a medium size print, or something small for social media. And then you take that sized image into Lightroom and you sharpen that. And that's how you do output sharpening workflow with Photoshop. Lightroom, so much easier. So much easier. DxO Pure Raw 3, Topaz, Denoise AI. Let's talk about these guys a little bit more. There is no best cream of the crop. I wouldn't say this is the one to choose. They all do things kind of differently. However, Topaz, I would say, gives you the most options, as I said before. Topaz gives you options for targeting particular kinds of softness or particular types of things that are out of focus or blur in an image. So that's a real benefit to Topaz. The downside to Topaz, as I also said before, is that it doesn't generate a raw file. It is processed. So there's a lot of there's a lot to be said about staying in the raw environment as long as you can, because we've all heard before what the benefits are sticking within that raw environment, in that raw converter in Lightroom. The goal, of course, to maintain quality of file before printing is to stay raw before processing. Okay. Well, I'm saying it here. Topaz produces a raw file. DxO and Denoise AI produce raw files. Topaz offers a bunch of options targeting blurred types. I've already said it all. We've got it getting ahead of myself. So gigapixel versus Adobe Enhance. Let me talk about this for a second. Now, Adobe Enhance is it's kind of Adobe's version of gigapixel in the sense that I select an image, I tell Lightroom I want to enhance that image, and then it kind of increases or doubles the size of that file. I think it's double the size. Actually, I don't know this one. I forget. Is it doubling or tripling? I don't know. But it does a significant increase in the file size of that image. And I have to say, it does an okay job. The good news is it keeps it in the raw environment, but man, gigapixel, ooh, especially with the recent algorithms that they've released, works amazingly well. So sure, I got to use a processed version of my file, but if I'm doing that at the end of my workflow, I got to say gigapixel's blowing away what Adobe's doing right now. These guys hopscotch each other with this technology. Adobe probably has something around the corner that's going to be really impressive. But as of this recording, gigapixel, I would say, hands down, increases the size of the image, the resolution of an image, much more efficiently. I mean, I'm really impressed with what they're doing, more so than what Adobe Enhance offers. Before I go to this, I want to go over to Lightroom now and walk through some of these things that I've been talking about here. So let me stop sharing my keynote. I'm going to move back over to Lightroom. Okay, so that said about gigapixel and Adobe Enhance, I'm going to bring you back over to Lightroom to kind of walk you through some of this stuff that I'm talking about here. So that said, let me go over to Lightroom, and this is the image that I want to show you. This is an image of a California live oak that I took over in Fort Ord. Of course, my computer's acting slow, so excuse me a minute. Wait for it. There's the image. Let's zoom out here for a second. There's our image. Again, this is an abstract pattern of a California live oak that I took in Fort Ord. waiting for this image to render a little bit. Part of it's rendered, part of it is not. My computer is acting slowly. There we go. There's the whole image. We can see all the detail now, which is important for a webinar on the ins and outs of sharpening. Okay, so first thing I mentioned is when we're sharpening images, we want to do this in a one-to-one view. So on the left-hand side of our screen in our navigator panel, we can click on 100% here, which will zoom our image in as such. And then we can go into our navigator panel and we can kind of move this around to target a particular area of the image that we want to see as we're applying our sharpening algorithm. Okay, so from here, let me close this side panel here so we have a little bit more real estate to work with. And now I'm going to open my detail panel. And there's already sharpening applied to this. So let's try and close this again. There we go. All right. So there's already sharpening applied to this. Let me double click on the sharpening word there and it will reset. There it is. Now my now my amount slider is reset. Now this is a Hasselblad image, and Hasselblad image comes in with a default of a amount slider already put at 40. Okay, so why 40 and why not 0, right? Why not zero this out completely? Well, Adobe has, taken put the effort into automatically adding a little bit to our images because Adobe knows, as a lot of people, a lot of the techs in the industry know, all digital files nowadays just need some kind of sharpening applied to them, a minimal amount of sharpening applied to them because of the anti-aliasing filters that are in front of our sensors, which purposely blur out the image for reasons, okay? And so because of that, a little bit of sharpening is automatically applied. Let me double click to reset that again to our digital files. In this case, the default is 40. It used to be 25. They increased it to 40. But from here, it's pretty simple. We simply take our sharpening amount and we increase it. I'm going to arbitrarily just kind of click with my cursor, bring it up to 104, and then you can hopefully see the before and after. It's going to be hard to see this through Zoom, but maybe you can follow along with one of your images as you go to see how the detail is working. The trick is zoom in, do your sharpening here, and see how the results come out. You're doing this to taste. This is a subjective thing. There's no formula to follow. And from there, we can talk about radius. Now, what radius is, in addition to amount's simple, just how much we're applying. But what is radius? Before I showed you that, well, sharpening is just simply a contrast tool, applying contrast on a pixel by pixel level. But let's say we have an edge that's defined, and that edge is defined by dark pixels next to lighter pixels, okay? Now, the radius determines the width by which that algorithm is being applied on a pixel by pixel level. So the radius's default is 1, or 1 pixel by 1 pixel, right? So if we want to broaden that or increase the threshold of that 1 pixel by 1 pixel level, we simply take our radius slider and start moving it to the right, above 1, up to 2, toward 3, etc. Let's zoom in again to 1600% to see what that might look like, okay? So we have an edge found. Let's find a good edge for this demonstration. Something like, hopefully this will do it. Yes, so we have light pixels next to dark pixels there, and I have sharpening applied to this. Let's apply a little bit more, okay? And now I'm going to take my radius slider. I'm going to move it all the way down at first. All the way down. There we go. All the way down. And now I'm going to just pump it up really quick. Now keep an eye on this zone of the image here as I'm doing this. Okay, keep an eye on this zone of the image here as I'm doing this. And here's before, and there's after. Before and after. Now keep an eye on another part. And actually, I think this part might look better. Keep an eye on this part of the image here. We have dark against lighter brown. Keep an eye on this. There's before, wait for it, and there's after. So what the effect of this is, though, however, is it will take If I were to take my radius slider and increase it like a lot, like go up to 2 or 3, this is not what you should be doing for your fine detail. This is what you should be doing for images that come in maybe a little bit soft, that have soft edges on them that you need to well, accentuate those edges and make them look like there's some contrast there. There's some lines that can be defined there. But images that are coming in already with good crisp focus, I always leave my radius at 1. I don't even touch it. But if it's a softer image, to whatever degree it is, playing with the radius slider can help you bring those images that are slightly soft into focus. Okay. Next is detail, and this is simply a slider that controls all of these kind of granular patterns here as you're sharpening. So if you want more of that to come out, increase your detail slider. If you want less of that to come out, decrease your detail slider. And then lastly, there's masking. Now, masking is a good tool for masking off part of the image that you do not want to apply your sharpening algorithm to. Maybe a part of the image to look at to demonstrate that would be this here. My masking slider, say I want to apply my sharpening algorithm to this, to the branch here, to the leaves, but not to the background. Okay, so as I apply my masking slider, I'm going to show you a little trick here. I'm going to hold down the Option key, and as I hold down the Option key and start to move the masking slider, notice my screen changes to black and white. And here, as I move my masking slider over, where things are black is where my sharpening algorithm is not applied. And then as I move it, there we go. What's white is where it's applied. Let me get back on top of it. Where it's white is applied and where it's black is not. So the masking slider is a kind of a fun little slider to mask off parts of the image that you do not want your sharpening algorithm applied to. So here's with it all the way down, and here's with it all the way up. Again, holding down the Option key as I go. Now, since I've showed you that with the Option key, I'm going to show you with the rest of it. If I hold down my Option key and go to the amount slider, my image turns to black and white. Kind of a fun little visual tool to help me see how much my sharpening algorithm is affecting the detail as I go by getting rid of the color. Same thing with radius. If I click on radius, I can see a much easier view of how it's increasing, excuse me, I should say expanding or contracting the radius by which that sharpening algorithm is being applied to the image on a pixel by pixel level. Here it is again all the way down at a 0.5 versus all the way up at 3. This is a 3 pixel level radius versus 0.5. See, this makes a lot more sense now looking at the radius slider with my Option key hit down. Let me put it back to the default of 1, and then detail as well. Holding down the Option key removes the color, another black and white view. I can see the detail and how the sharpening algorithm is affecting the detail. Okay, pretty cool. Little tip there. Option key, hold that down. The other thing that I mentioned there is chromatic aberration. I might see some chromatic aberration in the upper corners here of an image. To see that, a one-to-one view might not cut it, I have to say. Going into 400 or even 800 might be the thing to do to target chromatic aberration. And how we remove it is pretty simple. In the lens correction panel, we just simply check remove chromatic aberration. Let's see if I can find some here. That looks like there's some halos there. Let's see if those work. It's a subtle change, but it's a change. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, actually into 1600 to see that. Now we can see it. Remove chromatic aberration. Look at this zone of the image here as I'm checking and unchecking this box. We have a little bit of a magenta hue on here. Whoops. Go back in again. Here we go. And now I click remove. Now I'm sorry. Look here. There's a slight magenta hue to that there. Click it. It removes it. Click it. Removes it. Sometimes these halos are subtle. Sometimes they're really strong, and you'll see them when you print big. But if you click it, it gets rid of them like kind of magic. It detects where they are in the image, in particular parts of the image, and just simply removes them. Okay. Another thing that I want to show you is when we're exporting, what this looks like to export an image and look at the output sharpening options. So let's export this. Open our export panel. We're just going to choose desktop for that. Don't worry about file naming. File settings, we can do JPEG for purposes of this demonstration. Let's do a height and width just for the heck of it. Let's go, instead of pixels, we'll go inches. We're going to make a big print of this. Let's go 40 inches, 40 inches there, and tall, let's go 30 inches. This is a 4:3 aspect ratio image. Let's make our resolution 300. That's fine. I want to make something big, but really what matters here is what happens with the output sharpening panel. In the output sharpening panel, I simply click sharpen for, and as I said before, the options are really simple: screen, matte paper, or glossy. And then let's do matte paper, and the amount, low, standard, or high. Because we've determined previously, or in the panel just above this, what the height and width and resolution of our output application or output size is, the application is for print. Lightroom knows this, and then it knows that we're going to a matte paper, and we don't really need to go higher or lower, just do something standard. It knows what kind of sharpening algorithm it should apply to it for a big print. So it's super simple to do with Lightroom. And that's about that. Then just simply export. And that said, let me go back to my keynote presentation here. And that's kind of the ins and outs of sharpening. All right. Zoom in 100%, use those sliders, hold down the option key so you can get a clear view. Understand the difference between input and output sharpening. Don't let the sharpening on the input side of things seduce you too much, because at the end of the day, it's just a contrast tool, and we instinctively want to feel more depth in our images, but it's easy to take that stuff too far. So don't go as far as you can, and then back off a little bit to see if it still looks good, if it still handles it for you, because I see files coming in all the time that are just too much, So be careful with it. In terms of noise reduction, noise and sharpening go hand in hand. So keep an eye on that noise as you're sharpening. And then if you need to go into those luminance sliders, or maybe even the color noise slider for often those low light images, do that to taste when you're doing input sharpening, and your output sharpening algorithm will handle the noise to the best of its ability as well. But if that's not good enough, and honestly, I don't worry about denoising, and literally unless I'm making a big print. For stuff like social media and Instagram, it doesn't matter. Those images are tiny, so it just doesn't matter. But if I'm going to print, then I'll start to consider doing things like using Adobe Denoise AI, Topaz, DxO Pure Raw 3, one of those, or own them all and then play with them back and forth to see which one works best. But that's when those applications come in handy, and removing chromatic aberration and the details. But I've worked with photographers that for whatever reason do a lot of that stuff at the beginning of the workflow just so they can put stuff on Instagram. It just doesn't matter if that's what you're doing with your work. Worry about those images that you're going to print with. And of course, I encourage you guys to make prints of your work, so much so that in the last webinar where we had technical difficulties, we offered 20% off metal and paper prints on all of our print orders. Here is your coupon code LR Live. Just enter it in as you're making a print. You get 20% off any of our metals or any of our paper prints. Now, I said offer valid through March of 2024 because this is the coupon code that I gave with the webinar with the technical difficulties. However, we're going to extend it for obvious reasons, and we're going to extend it through May, through the next webinar. So forget this valid offer through March 2024 nonsense. We are extending this as a courtesy to you guys, and my way of saying I'm sorry, through May of 2024. All right. So there it is, LR Live coupon code over at Bradley Print Services. And then lastly, is I'd like to remind, we have, I think, 3 spots left, just 3 more for our trip to Kenya, the end of January in 2025. If you have any interest in hearing more about what we're doing, where we're going, what the itinerary is, what the price is, go to either bradleyprintservices.com or bradleyphotographic.com, or use this QR code here on your screen to go to our website to see more about it, and then contact us. We'll send you a booklet with more information to learn more about this trip in Kenya in January of 2025. That said, my apologies again for the technical difficulties with the first webinar. But here we are, done with this one. Please stay tuned for May 7th for our webinar at 11 a.m. Pacific time and not 6 p.m. with Jennifer Renwick from the Nature Photographers Network. Till then, thanks for tuning in, you guys. We'll see you soon.